Hey you guys, what's up? My name's Jason and today I'm going to be sharing with you a segment from my course on how to design characters and animate them in Photoshop for 2D games. Now, I want to offer this to everybody on YouTube for free because I really believe in giving things away for free and helping people out for free. Plus, that's the biggest reason why I'm here on YouTube and Udemy teaching people is because I just want to help people learn and I want to help them succeed. In the course, we're first going to design our character and sketch him out. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and we're going to move on to adding the detail and the color and all the shadowing. Then we're going to create a second character, and this character we're going to animate in Photoshop. We'll create a mock-up of the animation once we've created it, and then we're going to go ahead and create a sprite sheet for that because this is for a 2D game, and you have to use sprite sheets if you want to get this type of animation. If you're interested in taking the course, you can get a huge discount by clicking the link in the description or by hitting the link that's the little tab at the bottom left side of the screen. This will take you to a page where you can take the course at a huge discount. Now, the price of this course will go up over time. So if you are serious about learning how to do this, I recommend that you really take advantage of this opportunity. Now let's jump in and start creating this character. Now let's start adding some real detail to our character. So we're going to start off with his facial features, which will be in the head folder. First, we want to add a new layer above our clipping mask. So we'll add a new layer. Next, what we want to do is we want to use the circular marquee tool to create an oval. Now this oval is almost going to be a circle. About like that. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to fill that in with our fill tool and the color white. Fantastic. Now this is going to be the base for our eye. Now let's rotate it. So using the transform tool, which is Control T on a Windows and Command T on a Mac, we're going to rotate our eye just a little bit. About there will be do. Now this new layer is going to be turned into a clipping mask. So once again, we'll come up to layer and come down to create clipping mask. Now using our brush tool, we're going to use a hard edged brush. And about the size it is now will do. And we're going to create our iris. So I want to use a color very similar to this brown up here, but I want it to be lighter. So bring that up. And I think I actually want it to be a little bit more towards the yellow side. So I'll bring that up also. We'll hit OK. Switch back to the brush. And I'm going to enlarge the iris just by a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and put one dot in as his iris. Now you'll have to play around with the placement of his iris, but luckily, since it's its own layer, you can grab and move it and change the direction of where his eye is looking. So it's pretty cool. So play around with that and decide where you want your character looking. I think about there is good for me. Next, what I want to do is I want to paint in his pupil. So what we'll do is using the same exact color we had, we're just going to darken it. So we're going to bring it down very close to the blacks. About there will do. We'll hit OK. Next, we're going to switch over to our brush. Make sure that your brush size is a little bit smaller than the previous circle we created. So we'll make that a tiny bit smaller, and then we're going to fill that in, like so. Great. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to reselect this light brown, and then using our brush tool again and bringing down the size, we're going to add a highlight into his eye. Just like so. Now I might play around with the position of this, so we might undo that and try it in a different spot. We can try it down here. I think I like it probably somewhere in the middle, about there. Awesome. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to merge these two eye layers together so they're one. So this layer and that layer. So we're going to select both of them, right click, and merge layers. So now those are one layer. Now what we can do is we can copy that by selecting it with the marquee tool. Then we copy it and paste it. Great. So now we have two eyes. Now with the second eye, we're going to use the transform tool to put it in position and reshape it. So because of perspective, this eye will look different than that eye. I think I'm going to rotate it just a bit also. About there looks good. I think I'm also going to shrink it down vertically. So I'll turn the transform tool back on and bring it down just a tiny bit. This eye is on the other side of his head and a little bit further away from the viewer. Therefore, it's going to appear a little bit smaller. Now you can also play with the placement of things by using the arrow keys on your keyboard. So I'm just going to nudge this eye over just a little bit and see how that looks. So these two eyes are a little bit too close together for me. So what I can do is I can come over to my other eye and move him over with the arrows on my keyboard. Great. I think that looks a little bit better. Now we want to add some eyelashes to our character. Now, rather than drawing them on, that can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're using a mouse. What we can do is we can select both our eyes, then we're going to merge them together. So now they're on one layer. Next, we're going to select their shape. Now, the way you do this is by holding down Control on a Windows or Command on a Mac. Once you're holding that down, we're going to click this little thumbnail on the layer. What that will do is it'll make a selection of everything on that layer. You'll see here in a second. So now you can see that it selected his eye shapes. What we want to do now is we want to create a new layer underneath those eyes. Then we're going to fill those in with a dark gray. Almost a black. So somewhere about there. We'll hit OK. Then we're going to fill that in. Now you can't see it because the layer is behind those eyes. But what we're going to do now is using the arrows on our keyboard, we're going to nudge that layer up and it's going to create some eyelashes on the top of his eyes. So we'll switch to the grab and move tool and then push those up once, maybe twice. I like them about twice. Alright, great. Our character is really coming along now. The next thing we want to do is we want to add eyebrows to our character. So using the same gray color and my brush tool, I'm just going to paint in some eyebrows and see how they look. Now this might take some experimenting until you get the eyebrows looking the way you want. And that's okay. It's all part of the process. Alright, I think that looks good. Next, what we want to do is we want to add in a mouth. So I'm going to select this skin tone, then I'm going to darken it a little bit. So I'll bring it down to about there, and then we might bring it more over to the saturated side. And then I want to bring it down more towards the red side of the color spectrum. We'll hit OK, and now we can paint in some lips. Now usually what I'll do if I want to create a shape with a paintbrush is rather than trying to paint that shape, I'll paint something pretty close to it. Then using my erase tool, I can erase that away until I get the shape that I want. Alright, I think I like that shape. But I don't necessarily like the position, so what I can do is if I want to try other positions, I can use my lasso tool to trace that out. And now using the grab and move tool, I can move that around and try different positions for his mouth. Alright, I think right about there is good. Now the last thing we want to do is we want to add a cast shadow from his goggles. This will just make the character a little bit more interesting and realistic looking. Now the way we'll do that, we're going to create a new clipping mask on our head shape. So we'll add a new layer above that, but we want this to be above our skin layer. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to select a dark blue color. So we're going to come up to the blue spectrum, and then we're going to come down to a dark bluish grayish, about somewhere in there. We'll hit OK. Then we're going to paint in that cast shadow. Now I know this looks really funny, But in a second, we're going to bring down the opacity and it'll look a lot more like a shadow. Great. So now coming over to the opacity on our layer, we're going to bring that down. So now you can see it's looking a lot more like a shadow. Now the reason why we did a bluish grayish color for the shadow is because shadows tend to be a cool color. When you're creating shadows, use cool colors. When you're creating highlights, use warm colors. That's just a good rule of thumb to go by. Next, we want to create a new clipping mask. So what we'll do is we'll come down to the first clipping mask and we'll add a new layer. And remember, if you add a layer underneath a clipping mask, it'll automatically turn it into a clipping mask. But now we want to drag this clipping mask above our shadow clipping mask. All right. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add in a darker shadow along this edge. Usually in corners of walls and crevices and cracks, shadows get darker, and so we're going to add that darker shadow along this edge. So selecting the same color that we have here, we're going to darken that, and we're also going to bring the saturation a little bit higher. So about there should do, maybe a little bit darker. We'll hit OK. Next, using our brush tool and making sure we have a soft edged brush, we're going to paint in that little edge, just like so. Now if it looks too dark, you can always bring down the opacity on this layer. Now really quick, let's go ahead and let's label all of our layers within our head folder. So starting with the skin layer, we're going to label that skin. Then we'll label our next layer, which is the shadow layer, and we'll call it shadow. The next layer is also the second part of the shadow, so we'll also call that shadow. Next is his eyebrows and mouth, so we'll call that features. And lastly are his eyes, so we'll call that layer eyes. Now we can close this folder down. Next, we're going to work on his goggles and his hair. So first what we want to do is we want to come to the top layer in our goggles folder. Then we're going to add a new layer on top of that. Once we've done that, we're going to use our circular marquee tool to create a perfect circle that's going to be a little bit smaller than our goggle shape. Next, we're going to fill that in with a dark brown. So we're going to select our goggles color. Then we're going to bring that color down to the darker side. Hit OK. Now let's fill that shape in. Awesome. Next, what we want to do is we want to add a new layer on top of this. Now with this layer, we're going to use the same selection. We're just going to fill it in with a different color. So using our color picker, we're going to revert back to our goggles color. And we're going to bring that up so it's lighter. Somewhere about there looks good. And we're going to bring the color down more towards the red side. Hit OK. And now let's fill that shape in. Next, we want to unselect out of that selection. Then we're going to turn this layer into a clipping mask. Now using the grab and move tool, we're going to nudge it over with the arrow keys on our keyboard to about there. So now you can see it's created the illusion that there's a lens in his goggles and it's set back. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to select this lens shape by holding down Control on a Windows or Command on a Mac and hitting the thumbnail on the layer. Now we're going to come back to our color and we're going to take the same color, but we're going to make it a lot lighter. Hit OK. And using our brush tool and bringing down the size, we're going to just make a few streaks through there. These will act as reflections in his goggles. I think I'm going to make the second streak a lot smaller and thinner, like that. Awesome. Now just for texture, I'm going to add a few little spots in there. Cool. Now we can unselect out of that. and we're going to merge those two layers together. So we'll select both and merge. So now that's one layer. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to use the marquee tool to select that. We're going to copy it and paste it and bring it over to the other side of our goggle. Now, using the transform tool, we can shape that to fit into our second goggle. Great. Now the last thing we want to do on our goggles is add an undershadow to it to give it some form. So let's select this dark brown that we used for the shadow on the inside of the goggle. Then we're going to come down to our layers and let's create a new layer that's a clipping mask. So make sure you create it underneath another clipping mask so it will automatically create a clipping mask. And then we're going to drag that up to the top of our clipping masks. Now using the brush tool, let's zoom in there. Using the brush tool, we're going to just paint in this bottom edge. So as you can see, now it gives a bottom edge to that strap, so it's not just a flat strap. Next, we're going to add some form to the goggle piece, like so. And we'll do the same thing to the other side. Now this piece that's connecting the two goggles, it's going to have a little bit of form too, and we want to show that in its undershadow. Great. Now let's just add one more undershadow underneath this strap. Cool. So now our goggles are looking pretty dang good. Now let's move on to the hair. I like the hair right now. There's just one thing I want to do to it. I want to add a darker color on this edge. So what I'll do is, coming down to the hair layer, I'm going to create a new clipping mask. And I'm going to drag that above our original clipping mask. Then I'm going to select this orange right here that he has in his hair. Then using my brush tool and bringing up the size, I'm just going to paint a streak on this edge of his hair, like so. Maybe I want that a little thicker. Awesome. Let's also not forget to label our layers. So really quick, we're just going to go ahead and label these. I'm going to merge these two lenses together just to clean things up a bit. So now those are one. We'll call those lenses. Call that shadow. And we'll call this color. Then come down to the hair folder and we'll call this shadow. And we'll call this color. Great. Now we can close both these folders down. Now we're going to work on the scarf, the shirt, and the gloves. So let's start with the scarf. So we'll come down to the scarf layer. And what we want to do is we want to add a new clipping mask layer to it. But we want it to be above all the other clipping masks. Next, we're going to select the color of our scarf. Then we're going to change the color to a little bit darker color. Next, we're going to start painting in the shadows on our scarf. And once again, like I said, if I can't get the shape perfect with the paintbrush, what I'll do is I'll come back in with the eraser and erase away until I get my shape. The hotkey for the eraser is the letter E. Awesome. Next, what I want to do is I want to create another clipping mask. So I'll add another layer and drag that above this clipping mask. Then we're going to reselect our scarf color. Now I want a lighter version of this color. So I'm going to come up, hit OK, and now I'm going to brush in my highlights. Great. Now I think my shadows are looking a little bit too dark, so I'm going to come back to my shadow layer and I'm going to bring down the opacity. I think about there looks good, and I think it's the same for my highlights. So I'm going to go to my highlight layer and I'm going to bring down the opacity on that also. Right about there should be good. Now let's label all of those layers. So we'll label this highlight. We'll label the next one shadow. And we'll label this last one color. Now we can close this folder. Next, let's move on to the shirt. So we'll come to our shirt layer and we're going to create a new clipping layer. Now we'll drag that to the top. Now let's select the color of our shirt. Then we're going to darken that almost to black. We'll hit OK. Then let's start painting on the shadow on our shirt. Now let's bring down the opacity on that layer. I think about 50% should be good. Now let's create a new clipping mask. We want this one to be below our shadow layer. Now we're going to select this blue on his gloves, and using our brush tool we're going to paint in some cool designs onto his shirt. Great. So now you can see why we wanted to put this layer underneath our shadow layer. So that way the shadows were being cast on both the brown and the blue parts of the shirt. Alright, now let's label these layers. So we'll start with the top one. We'll call it shadow. And we'll move on to the next one. We'll call this blue. Then let's call this last one color. Great. Now let's close that folder. And now we can move on to the gloves. So let's create a new clipping mask. And let's bring it above our color layer. Next, we're going to select this dark blue right here that's in the shadow. So we want to grab that color. And now we can start painting in the shadows on the gloves. This way the shadows match the shadows on a shirt. Awesome. Now, I know that the blue in this shadow and the blue in these shadows should match, but sometimes things just don't look right and you don't have to follow rules strictly when you're creating artwork. So I'm going to bring down the opacity on these guys because I think it'll look better. I think right about there should do at 75%. Awesome. Our character is really starting to come along. Alright. Next, let's work on the pants and the boots. So let's come to our pants layer, and we're going to create a new clipping mask. We'll drag that above our color layer. Then let's select this color. Now let's find a shadow for it. It's best to go darker because you can always bring down the opacity on your shadow. Hit OK. Now let's brush in those shadows. Great. Now, let's bring down the opacity on those shadows. I think about there looks good. Next, let's add an extra dark shadow right here on this ledge between the shirt and the pants. The way we'll do that is by coming over to our shadow layer and selecting its shape by holding down Control or Command and then hitting the thumbnail. Next, we're going to create a new clipping layer, and we want to make sure it's above our shadow layer. Then we're going to use our color picker to select this shadow blue, and then we're going to darken that even more. About there should be good. Now make sure you're on a soft edged brush, and we're going to paint in a line right about there. Awesome. Now we can unselect out of that shape. Looking pretty good. Now let's label these layers. So we'll call this layer shadow. We'll call the next layer shadow. And we'll call this last layer color. Now we can close that folder. Now let's work on our boots. So let's create a new clipping mask, and let's bring it to the very top of our layers. Now we'll select our boot color, we'll create a shadow color for it, hit OK, and now let's brush that in. Make sure we switch back over to a hard-edged brush, and now we can paint in those shadows. Great. Now let's turn down the opacity on this shadow. I think that looks good. And now we're going to do the same thing we did with the shadow from our shirt. So let's select this shape. Next, let's add a new clipping layer and bring it above our shadow. Then we'll select this color. We'll bring down the darkness. Then switch over to a soft brush. And then we'll paint in that undershadow. Great. Now we can unselect out of that shape. Now as you can see, it got up here on the top part of the boot, which we don't want it there. So using our erase tool, we'll just erase that out. Now let's add some highlights. So we'll select our boot color. Then we're going to lighten that. Next, let's add a new clipping mask and bring it above our shadow layer. Make sure that you switch back to a hard-edged brush. And I'm going to add a highlight right here on the top of the boot. This little lip. I'm also going to add a highlight. Then let's not forget to label our layers. So we'll call this first one highlight. We'll call this next one shadow. We'll call the next one shadow. And then we'll call this last one color. Great. Now we can close that folder. Now lastly, we can work on our blade and handle. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my head layer and my hair layer so that I can see my blade better. So we'll scroll up there. There's the head. And there's the hair. Oh, and my goggles layer. We want to turn that off too. So now we can see our blade a lot better. Next, what I want to do is I want to come down to my blade layer, and I'm going to create a new clipping mask. We're going to drag that clipping mask above our color layer. Then using the lasso tool and making sure you're on the polygonal lasso tool, which means you can create straight lines, we're going to create the shape of the edge of our blade. Something like that should work. Next, we're going to change our color to the color white, and we're going to fill that in. Next, let's change this layer type. So we'll come over here and let's change it to overlay. Awesome. Now we're going to bring down the opacity on that. I think about 50% looks good. We can unselect out of this selection now. Now we want to add an edge to this blade over here too. Since our light source is coming from over here, we're going to make this side more of a shadow. So we'll use our lasso tool again. Starting from this corner, we're going to create our edge. And we'll follow that edge as best as possible. Then we're going to fill this in with a dark gray. Somewhere around there. Hit OK. And we're just going to keep this on the same layer. Great. Next, what I want to do is I'm going to create a new clipping mask. And using my brush tool with a soft edge, I'm going to give it a soft edge on the bottom side of this blade. This is just to help make it look more metallic. So I'll increase the size of my brush. and paint across like so. Now that's a little bit too dark for me, so I'm going to bring down the opacity. Great. I'm going to switch back over to white. Then I'll add a new layer. And I'm going to add a little bit of a light reflection right here. This is just because the light would probably be bouncing off the wood and giving a lighter reflection onto the metal. Now that's a little bit too bright, so I'm going to turn that down. That looks about good to me. Lastly, I'd like to add some chips to the edge of our blade. That'll just give it some more character. The way we're going to do this is first, we're going to select all of our layers in our blade folder. Then we're going to hit Control J on our keyboard, or Command J if you're on a Mac. What this has done is it's now copied all of those layers I had selected. So now I have two versions of them. I'm doing this because I'm about to merge these layers together, and I'm going to lose all of my layers when I do that. So I want backup in case something goes wrong. So now let's put all of these into a folder, and we'll label it layers. Now we can select all of these layers and merge them together. Now we want to turn off our layers folder. That's because it's creating a second blade on top of our other blade. So once we start doing things to the bottom blade, you're not going to be able to see it because it's covered up by the second blade. So let's turn that off. Now let's use our lasso tool, and we're going to start creating little triangles into our blade. Then we can hit delete and it'll cut that out. Let's create a second one. I'm going to make this one a little bit more rounded. And we don't want to do too many. Less is always more. Awesome. I think that looks cool. Now we can turn his head on and see how they look together. Awesome. It's looking good. Now let's go ahead and label all those layers. Awesome. It's looking good. Now we can go ahead and close that folder. Now let's move on to the handle. So let's create a new clipping mask, and we'll drag that to the top. Next, we're going to select that brown color on the handle, and we're going to create a shadow color for it. And using our brush, making sure we're on a hard-edged brush, we can start painting in those shadows. I'm going to add a circle shadow right here. And that's because I'm eventually going to add a jewel there. Now let's create a new clipping mask and bring it to the top. Then let's select our handle color and let's create a lighter version of that. We'll hit OK. Then we can start painting on our highlights. Awesome. Now lastly, let's add in that jewel. So I like this blue color, so I'm going to make my jewel that color. So we'll add a new layer. It doesn't matter if it's a clipping mask or not. Next, we're going to select this shadow blue. Then using our paintbrush, let's go ahead and paint in our jewel. We want to make sure that the shadow is on this side of the jewel. Next, we'll select this lighter blue. Then using our paintbrush, let's paint in a circle within this circle, like so. Next, let's brighten this color of blue to about there. We'll hit OK. And now we can add a nice highlight to our jewel. Awesome. Now it really looks like a jewel. This is fantastic. We made it to the end of creating our character. Now in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how you can make some adjustments and do some cool things with your characters. But we're basically done with the design.